Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creation Matters podcast. We are part of the Creation Ministries of the Ozark. It's a nonprofit ministry associated with the Creation Experience Museum here in Branson, Missouri. Our whole purpose and mission is really just to use science to showcase the existence of a creator and to effectively convey the message of the gospel. I'm your host today. My name is Taylor Schroeder, and with me I have Ashley Coulter.
Hello.
And our special guest for this very first episode is none other than Curtis Baker, the president of the museum.
Hi, guys. How's everybody doing today?
We are doing fantastic,
awesome.
and we are so excited to have you here on the show with us today. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, Curtis, and about the museum. I'm sure a lot of people have never even heard of the Creation Experience Museum in Branson, Missouri. They know of the one in Kentucky, but not so much familiar with the one here.
Yes. Speaking of which, people come to Branson by the millions, and you think, well, everybody has been by the museum, but they haven't. A lot of people have not heard of us. We are a creation-based ministry. We started in about 2008, and we opened our first little museum outside Springfield, Missouri in 2011. 2014, we were able to acquire the building that we're currently in, that we're using temporarily. We're in our 10th season in Branson. We're easy to find. We're right on Highway 65. If you're heading into Branson from the north, you can't miss us. If you're coming from Branson from the south, you'll find us on the north edge. Currently, we also have 50 acres, one exit closer into Branson, where God has blessed us with this property where we're going to be building a state-of-the-art creation museum. And one of the coolest things about our museum, guys, is it's free admission. We don't charge people to come in to look at the museum. The tour guides take you through. And in there, you're going to see artifacts and fossils and other cool things to do. We have a video presentation. It is so exciting when we have visitors come in. But before long, you're going to start hearing a lot about the Creation Experience Museum in Branson, along with the one that you always hear about in Kentucky. Our good friends up there at Ken Ham and them have built a great museum up there, and they have really kind of broke the mold on the creation museums. And so hopefully someday we'll be in those kind of conversations people have about creation museums.
That is so exciting, and thank you for sharing about that. We are going to be discussing fossils today. And
I tell you, there's nothing more I'd rather talk about in a museum than fossils sometimes. So I'm glad you guys brought that topic up.
Yes. No, we are excited to delve into that because we know that you have been in creation ministry for 20 years, and you've been on dinosaur digs. You've done the work, the research, all of that, and we would like to delve in right away as quickly as we can and start off with some questions.
Oh, boy, yeah. Let's get this thing going, because if you get me talking about fossils and rocks and dead things, it's going to be a long day.
So I'm going to have Taylor, our host today, start us off, if that's all right.
So specifically, as we start this discussion of fossils, a lot of people out there probably they've heard the term fossils thrown around, but can you just give us a simple definition of what a fossil actually is?
Sure. A lot of people are confused about what a fossil is and isn't. One of the first things they do is they get archaeology and paleontology confused. Archaeology specifically deals with human artifacts. Paleontology deals with like the study of bones and things like that and organic fossils. Mm-hmm. Many years ago, they used the word fossil, which means literally to be dug up. And they would use that for anything they dug out of the ground, pottery, arrowheads. And then recently, around the 1800s, people began separating the terms. And today, the word fossil is basically associated with bones, things like that, plants and other things that have been dug out of the ground that were once living. These items, these organisms, are things that were soft-bodied, living things that were rapidly buried in a very special condition that have been mineralized through the transfer of minerals through the soil, and now they've actually have become part of the rock. Interestingly about fossils a lot of people think, there was these rocks and these things fell on the rocks. That's not quite how it happened. What you have is soft sediments, mud, silt, sand, slush. That's not rock. These organisms are caught up in that. So at the same exact time the rock is forming, becoming rock, these organisms are also becoming rock, which is basically what a fossil is. So the fossil is part of the rock. So all fossils are rocks, but not all rocks are fossils.
So cool. So interesting. So what you're saying, there's different kinds of fossils. Are there names for those different kinds of fossils, the plants versus an animal fossil?
Yes, and a lot of times you'll hear, if you ever look up the scientific name, it's a two-part name. Usually the first part will tell you the genus of the creature or the organism, and the other part was associated with either the rock it was found in or the person who found it. And they give them these scientific names. Sometimes those names, I don't really like those names because they're so hard to pronounce. For instance, there's this one oyster that has this big scientific name, but its nickname is the devil's toenail. I like that much better, just because the way it appears. But then there's another fossil called a brachiopod, which is a marine-based fossil. Now, the brachiopod is its scientific name, and sometimes people give it they'll call it something else. They're going to call it like a lamp clam. I'm like, I don't like the word lamp clam. I like brachiopod. But yeah, they change them. They'll go into what we call animal-based ones, which are usually the bones of that. Then you have your marine fossils. 95% of all fossils we find in the fossil record are marine-based. Only 5% are everything else, including plants, including animal-based. Of that 5% that's there, less than 0.5% is actually dinosaur. So
Oh.
they only make a very small part of the fossil record, which a lot of people think, oh, if it's a fossil, it's a dinosaur.
Yeah.
A lot of times you're going to pick up something in a creek at your house or walking behind in a riverbed, and you're going to pick up this little rock and you're saying, oh, I found a dinosaur tooth. More than likely you found a marine fossil that just looks like that. There's even some fossils people have brought forth that they thought were fossils. They had them examined because they thought they found a human foot. Actually, what they found was a funny-shaped rock in a creek bed. So
I know I find those all the time in my
Yeah,
house.
it's easy to do. So there seems to be a lot of confusion in the world today about how a fossil is formed. We're told that it takes millions of years for a fossil to form. Curtis, why don't you explain to us how a fossil is really formed and kind of go in a little deeper on that?
Sure. Well, one of the things you picked up there on Ashley was they assume that it takes millions of years, long times for the fossil to form. The traditional story is that a fossil sinks into this soft sediment, and the sediment somehow turns to rock, and then over a long period of time, the organism also turns to rock. Well, that's not true. They turn to rock at the same exact time. And so for a fossil to be forming, it is forming in usually a wet, slurry, soft, sedimentary rock means covered by water. So
Okay.
you have this water-based material. In there, you have decomposing. So if you have something fall in there, a leaf, a bone, a foot, anything like that, it is subject to decomposing really rapidly, especially a fish. They find fish fossils everywhere. They've even found fish fossils and clam fossils on Mount Everest. So whenever you find these things in these areas, you're thinking, how did this fish get fossilized, yet it never decomposed? When today, a fish that you pull out of water that's dead will decompose within hours. That's because that slurry it was buried in has been depleted of oxygen because the way it's formed. So you have to have them buried. You have to have no oxygen, no burrowing animals, no bacteria, and no sunlight. You do not want to expose them to UV light. If any of the decomposing factors, those ones I just mentioned, get to the organism, it will never be there. It'll decompose. You wouldn't have a fossil. But because we have millions of fossils buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth, tells us that there had to be a special event we don't see today. Something's happened to bury these soft body tissue organisms. You can find octopus, squid, you can find all kinds of worms even. Everything from worm to dinosaur buried. It doesn't matter. Everything was buried at the same time in this slurry of stuff. Therefore, the fossils cannot take millions of years to form because the organism doesn't have millions of years to lay there without decomposing. Within just a short time, either a burrowing animal, sunlight, or oxygen would make its way into the soil and would destroy it. And actually, that's what happens today. If you have a pet or something and you want to dig a hole, the pet passes away, and you're like, I'll just dig a big hole in my yard and bury it. You come back in 10 years, the pet's gone. That's because we have oxygen in the soil, we have burrowing animals, and we have bacteria. And those kind of things destroy the organism and turn it into fertilizer.
So when you talk about fossils forming in a short amount of time, what is a short amount of time?
They have found things that have undergone a form of fossilization called petrification. They have found things in caves, hats, a honey sugar ham, totally turned to rock.
Wow.
They've also found cowboy boots that have limestone in them that have started turning. Teddy bears. There's actually a spot in the world where people will take teddy bears, put them in this cave, and within just less than a year, you'll end up with a rock solid teddy bear.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
So
just don't cuddle that one in. No.
Right. So it's not time, it's the right conditions
Exactly.
to form a fossil.
Yeah. Time is actually the enemy of a fossil.
Really?
If you have an organism on the ground and you have lots of time, you won't have an organism. So you have to have it rapidly buried in a special condition. And then once you dig them out, the clock starts ticking again because now you've exposed them to UV light, oxygen, bacteria, humidity, and now they start falling apart again. Mm-hmm. So preserving the fossils is even a bigger challenge than you would think.
Meaning, obviously, that millions of years does not make any sense.
It doesn't, not in the world of science. In fact, I'm holding in my hand a book that I use sometimes when I dig out fossils for a guidebook, and it's the Smithsonian Handbook Guide to Fossils. Now, you might think, wait a minute, Smithsonian, they support millions of years. Kinda. But in the introduction pages from the author's introduction, the two authors make a statement. They say that fossils are evidence that things were once rapidly buried. I have to say I agree with them. Fossils were once rapidly buried. But then their next sentence I don't agree with because it's anti-science. It says, and after millions of years, they turned to rock. Mm-hmm. Well, again, we just discussed, you cannot have millions of years and a plant leaf laying on the ground at the same time.
Right.
The plant leaf will decompose very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
So as being part of a creation museum, obviously, well, not obviously, but we believe the Bible to be the infallible Word of God. And so
absolutely.
In the Bible, we know in the beginning, towards the beginning in Genesis, we read about a worldwide flood. Mm-hmm. And you keep mentioning this certain event that would have had to have happened for all these fossils that we find today to have formed the way they did. We see ocean creatures on mountaintops. That doesn't make sense unless we had a worldwide flood.
Exactly, because in Genesis 6, it starts talking about the flood, what we call the Noah's flood, and it lists, for 2 chapters, it talks about how this event unfolds. Well, at the chapter 8, when you get there, you're seeing the end of the flood, and he gives us some very interesting details. It says, after so many days, the mountaintops begin to appear, which tells us the mountaintops were covered, which would make sense because the ocean water would have been above the mountain. Therefore, you'd have sea creatures at the top of the mountains.
Right.
And then it says, as the waters begin to go down, Noah, according to the Bible's record, releases birds out of the ark to go search for dry land. The first few trips, they fail. They come back with no evidence. Finally, one of the birds leave and doesn't come back. And the scripture says it was a sign to Noah that the ground had begun to dry up. Those soft sediments are now forming into rock, solid land. It's still another 40 days, according to the scriptures, before God tells Noah, you can now remove the covering and leave the ark. Could you imagine if you're in a worldwide flood and the ark comes to rest on a mountaintop that's soft sediments and you step off, you're going waist deep in the mud. So the Lord of the scriptures knew that they had to stay inside the ark and wait for the ground to harden up. That just sounds almost like a fairy tale to some people until you get to the top of mountains where there's sedimentary rock and marine fossils. You're like, well, wait a minute. Now this is starting to make sense. Just so you guys know, back in the 1500s when Martin Luther, he saw fossils on top of the mountains, he said this, I believe, would confirm the worldwide flood. Well, people dismissed it as religious talk. But around that same time period lived another man named Leonardo da Vinci. In his notes, he talks about how fossils were probably formed from a mineral transfer from the muds and the sediments that formed the fossils. Leonardo da Vinci had it right, but that would have been considered a heretic at the time, so he never brought it forth. And it wasn't until the 19th century when somebody was going through his notes, they saw that he had actually recorded it. So common sense was telling these men something had to cause this. It had to be global. It had to be catastrophic. But they weren't allowed to say it out loud for fear of persecution.
Wow.
Wow. So, with the flood and all of the conditions, obviously, that would make it the right environment for fossils to form, are most of the fossils we find today a result of the flood?
I would have to say yes. I'd have to say yes, that statement that to find a fossil forming today is not impossible, but it's so rare that if we did not have the worldwide flood, you and I would not be sitting here having a podcast about fossils. We would be talking about, oh, there's one place in Germany or New York that has this rare thing. They're calling it a fossil, whatever that is. It'd be so rare. Today, fossilization is rare. We do find a lot of petrification today, which is a form of fossilization. But as far as sedimentary rocks bearing things, turning into fossils, it's just absent today. If you have floods today, but the things caught in those floodwaters don't turn to fossils. But in the past, things caught in floodwaters turned to fossils. So the conditions had to be different. So I would have to say, since we have billions of dead things buried in rock layers, there had to be a time where they were all formed about the same time because we find them mixed up together. You're going to find plants with animals, and the longer they dig in the ground year after year, the more they find these fossils that contradict their previous ideas. For instance, they used to say that flowering plants did not evolve for millions of years after dinosaurs. Some paleontologists even say dinosaurs didn't even know what a flowering plant was. But just a few years ago in China, they were digging in this rock and they found fossilized dinosaurs, and next to it they found fossilized chili peppers, a nightshade vegetable.
Wow.
Now, according to them, they were supposed to be separated by 15 million years, but yet here they are together in the same rock.
Which proves that they were in the same time together. Yeah.
And they're finding flowering plants in China way below the so-called millions-year-old dinosaurs. So then you have to ask yourself, so which is it? Which came first, the dinosaur or the plants? Well, you know, the old chicken and egg story. So they're trying to figure this out. So what they do is they just change the story a little bit. They change the story a little, but they will not give up the millions of years. But here's my take on it, guys. If your ideas are consistently being overturned and consistently being proven wrong, maybe you should change your ideas. Quit changing the math to fit your ideas. Change your ideas to fit the math.
Yeah, I think that all goes back to, you know, the reliability of the Bible as God's word, and everything that's in God's word, it lines up with the science. Like, if it's in God's word and he tells us exactly how it is, and what we find when we go out digging or we use science, it all just points back to his word, and that confirms what we all knew all along, that God's words are true. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you don't have to change your faith to fit science. Science, when fully tested, and it runs its course, especially in paleontology and fossils, when you openly examine it, it actually confirms your faith. You don't have to change your faith. And there has been some people in the past that said, well, maybe I need to read the Bible different to match the science. Well, which science? The science of Leonardo da Vinci, the science of Martin Luther, the science of Charles Darwin? Which science? Because they've all had different opinions about science. If you're constantly changing the Bible to fit the science, you're constantly changing the Bible. That's not a very steady faith. To have something that you can put faith into and you can trust, that part of you does not need to change. We don't take, at the Creation Ministries of the Ozarks and Creation Experience Museum, we do not take a tidbit of science and tweak it and adjust it and make it pigeonholed to fit our worldview, although we've been accused of that. What we actually do is we just read the Bible straightforward, we believe what it says, and we welcome open science to be tested in light of the Scriptures. And every time we do, we're not disappointed. It confirms the Scriptures that we all trusted in. So we don't pigeonhole it and then tweak it and adjust it. We just let it speak for itself. Now, we do critique the science, and I think that's healthy. We need to say, wait a minute, who says it's millions of years old? I could ask this question to your guests and to your listeners right now, to all your audience, and I could say this. I could say, name the first person who decided fossils were millions of years old. And most people are going to say Charles Darwin, and they would be wrong. They don't even know. They don't even know where it came from. They've never looked into it. That's called blind faith.
Mm-hmm.
They're following a worldview. They don't even know where it originated.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you tell them it actually originated in Greek mythology, they say, well, oh, no. Say, oh, by the way, Greek mythology is a religion.
Mm-hmm.
Evolution has its roots in mythology and religion.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So people don't even realize that. And then the person who influenced Darwin, the Huxley guy who influenced Darwin, he actually studied Greek mythology. And he wrote a book called The Principles of Geology. And in there, he intertwined his Greek mythology in with geology. So you had mythology and geology mixed together. That was the book that influenced Charles Darwin.
Wow.
So,
Wow. Okay, Curtis. So now we come to a question that I feel like a lot of people want to know about fossils, and it is, why do we mostly find animal fossils, not human ones?
oh, I didn't know there was going to be a test on this one. All right, that is a deep question. Get it? Fossils, deep question. That's a paleontology joke. Anyway, I will let you guys know there's a reason why. And it has to do with logic and reason and physics. A lot of people, when they look at the fossil record, omit logic, reason, and physics. If things are rapidly buried during a catastrophe, you're going to have certain things that come into play. You're going to have panic. You're going to have intelligent beings figuring out a way of escape. You're going to have some things running into the danger zone, just like you would today in a forest fire or a hurricane or tsunami. You have confusion. You have these kind of things. If you're thinking of the fossilization record, you got to go back and think, okay, what time period was Noah's flood? You're talking over 4,400 years ago. The human population at that time is a lot less than it is now. So for one, people are thinner as far as population concentrations on the earth. They're not concentrated as much. People are living in areas that are farmlands, fertiles. That's what they do. They're farmers. They're stuff like that. They're not living in clusters like we have today in these big cities. So the population is not as dense. It's more fragmented. Animals still run in herds and packs and so on. They are dense and concentrated. You can go to the Africa, out in the middle of nowhere in Africa, safari, and you'll find a herd of elephants. You'll find these packs of lions and stuff. They're all concentrated together. They're not spread out. So when a catastrophe hits, more than likely, those who are in large packs and herds, you're going to have higher numbers of them being buried. Plus, when humans sense danger, we automatically have an intelligence level where we know how to react and we run to safety. During the flood, you're going to have the flood waters, the fountains of the great deep breaking open. You're going to have the flood waters coming up, the rain's coming down. Something is kicking in the humans, and they're thinking, I got to get out of here. And they're looking for a way of escape. More than likely, most of the humans that did not make it into the ark, the ones that were outside the ark, that group of humans more than likely became bait for fish and other things swimming in the water. They were decomposed, they were chewed on and whatever. Very few of them were ever fossilized because they were escaping. Animals tend to just run away what they think is danger, and they'll run just to safe, what they think is a safe place. Animals, herds of them, can actually run into a valley or into a boxed-in canyon, and there they sit. And they'll sit there and wait to die. They're not going to try to climb out of the canyon. If you or I are in a canyon and we see floodwaters coming, we're going to start climbing the wall.
Yes.
Well, if you're a dinosaur, what are you going to do? You four-legged dinosaur, you're not going to climb the wall. You just stand there, and they basically throw in the towel and they're buried. Now, the marine fossils I talked about, the 95% of the fossil record that is ocean-based, those were caught up so quickly in the initial stages of the flood, they didn't have time for escape. They were buried quickly on. But we also don't find fossils of lions, cheetahs, panthers. Those are also creatures that are alive today. Nobody questions why we don't have fossils of them. They're fast, and they run away from danger, and they have a way of escape. Have you ever tried to corner a fox? He has an escape route. You ever tried to corner a rabbit? He has an escape route. Now, You can corral cattle. You can corral bison, other large animals. You can corral elephants. It's very hard to corral a pack of lions. So you see the difference. Humans would have that same response. And I'm avoiding a word that everybody's waiting for me to say, and it's instinct. I believe that we have engineered information put into us by God that allows us to make those quick split-second decisions. And some of the animals also had that ability. But the big herd animals and stuff like that, they didn't have a way of escape. They don't think of those things. They just say, oh, okay, here it comes. And they just take it. So that's why when you see these animals, and they're usually found in clusters like that. And by the way, they've only found, I think it's less than around a half a dozen or so T-Rex fossils worldwide. Just because they're not worldwide. They're all found in North America. And some people have the impression that, oh, there was T-Rexes everywhere. No, they weren't. They were here in North America. They finally found parts of one they said in Canada just recently last year. Up until then, they were only found in the United States. So you're not going to find them like that. And the human population, again, is just not there. But we do find other kinds of human fossils that they tend to overlook. These fossils are so important, they're called trace fossils. These would be the remains left behind by the creature. A lot of times it's the footprints. They do find lots of human footprints. So that means there were humans alive during the time of the fossilization process. They were just on the move. So, but if you ever wanted to find a good example of a human fossil, just look at Pompeii.
Okay.
The humans did not leave. They did not heed the warning. They became like a herd animal. They just stayed put, and they suffered the consequences. So.
Wow, that's very interesting. I think another question that people, I know at least I have often thought this myself, is why do we generally find fragments of fossils or like pieces of an animal instead of the whole animal together itself?
Oh, yeah, that goes right back to those floodwaters. Remember, the worldwide flood, the fountains of the great deep broke open. Then the windows of heaven were open and it rained. During the time of that, you had the fracturing of the Earth's crust, what some scientists refer to as Pangea splitting apart. You would have the tectonic plates moving. You're going to have sediments and soil, earthquakes, tsunamis, everything going on. When something gets buried and hit by these waves, they get hit by these large boulders and the large amounts of mud, these organisms sometimes are blown apart. Other times, as the animal is being buried there, those sediments are soft and they're still shifting and moving. So the sediment itself will begin to settle, where part of the animal might be buried on something a little more solid and the other part shifts out of it. They have found woolly mammoths buried in the ice, standing in an upright position with their spine, their backbone broken in half. That's from the weight of the shifting ice.
Wow.
Have snapped it. But since they were in permafrost, they didn't go anywhere, but they were broken. Now, if that would have happened with just soft mud, tons and tons of mud above him would have broke his back. As that mud continues to shift and to move and to settle, it could have moved the parts away. And sometimes those parts are exposed to the elements before the next layer buries it. Therefore, that part actually decomposes and is no longer there. So it has to do with impacts, destruction, and then a little bit of decomposing before they're ever turned to a fossil. So.
Wow. So, Curtis, we kind of discussed this earlier, not discussed it, mentioned it more like you have been on digs, dinosaur digs.
Oh, yes.
Where have those digs taken place, and what are maybe some preconceived ideas that people would have for going on a dinosaur dig, what they would think they would find versus what you have actually found?
Oh, good. We've been to, my wife and I, Sherry, and some of the team members at the museum before the paleo team, we've been to Texas several times down there to looking at what we call the trace fossils, dinosaur footprints, and other things. We've been to Colorado in the high desert, Northwest County, of the northwest corner of Colorado. We've been to Kansas, western Kansas, salt into the chalk beds. We've also been to Montana, up there in the Badlands, digging up there.
Wow.
We have found on these digs anything that you had a preconceived idea of a fossil. When you walk out there, your opinion is going to change. For instance, you go to western Kansas, you're walking through what you and I would call cattle land. There's oil rigs going on. There's big cattle ranches. You can see the cows out in the distance. You're in the middle of nowhere, miles from civilization. And all of a sudden you look underneath your feet. What you think you've been walking on is just loose soil. You realize are clams. They're oysters and other stuff. And then you find shark's teeth underneath your shoes.
Wow.
And you're like, wait a minute. This is western Kansas. How'd these ocean creatures get here? You go to Texas and you're walking in the river down there called the Biloxi River. And in the summertime, that river dries up and the footprints in the bottom of the river are exposed. Now, one of the things that happened last year in Glen Rose and the Biloxi River was they experienced a century-old drought. Never has happened in the last 100 years. The river dried up and exposed new footprints that nobody could remember being there. The old-timers have all passed on, the ones who knew about them. Anybody who's been alive in the last 100 years said, wow, these are interesting. There's so many footprints, 400 footprints, in an area the size of, maybe a 50 foot by 50 foot riverbed, 400 footprints. The state of Texas paleontology people nicknamed it the ballroom. They said, oh, the dinosaurs were dancing. Now, I know I've watched some dinosaur cartoons on TV and they dance, but in reality, dinosaurs did not dance. They didn't have a barn dance. Mm-hmm. There has to be another explanation. But by them calling it the ballroom and saying the dinosaurs were dancing really misleads the general public. The general public needs to say, wait a minute, why are these dinosaurs here? And why are these footprints going all different directions as if they were dancing? What was going on? Mm-hmm. What was going on was a stampede. It was a mass panic site. You had theropod, three-toed dinosaurs, mixed with four-legged dinosaurs, the big sauropods, all running on top of each other and around each other, trying to get out of each other's way. Hundreds of them, babies, adults, all together. That is a mass stampede. So now we back up and ask ourselves the next question. What on earth would send two giant species, into mass panic? It had to be something coming. Mm. And they didn't know how to get out of there. They herd animals, and they were being chased. But because they found an exit, their bones aren't there, which they have found a few of their bones there, but we find a lot of footprints there. You go to Colorado. You climb up the mountains. You're 6,000 foot up in the Morrison Formation. And as you're going up the side of the mountain, you're passing Stegosaurus fossils, sauropod fossils, allosaur fossils, all buried together in one area on the mountain. And people would not expect that. You would expect to find them down in the low valleys, but here they are in the mountaintops. What were they running from? Why were they going up the mountain? Mixed species. Mm-hmm. Then you can find a trail of dinosaur footprints that goes all the way from Texas, goes up through the Texas Panhandle, right up the Rocky Mountains, and takes a turn and goes towards Alberta, Canada, and then breaks left and goes towards Alaska. Dinosaur trails.
Wow.
Where were the animals going, and why are they all running north? See, those are questions we have to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
Looking at the fossil record, you start asking questions. There was a gentleman with us on our dig in Colorado. He was from New Zealand or South America, one of those countries. He was a filmmaker. He came there because his son had a passion for dinosaurs, and he comes there just to kind of document it. And he was going to hang out there to see what was going on the dig. And one day during the dig, him and I were up on the top of the mountain picking up gastroliths, which are the stomach stones the dinosaur swallows. And we're searching for these, and he picks up this huge baseball-sized gastrolith, this stomach stone. And he looks at me, and he says, this thing looks like it was just made yesterday. Now, we're in the high desert. We are actually 2 hours from the nearest public facility of any kind. There's nobody around us. We're miles from the highway. And he picks up this rock and he says, oh, here's another one. And he says, it looks like somebody just put these here. They're so fresh looking. And I said, yeah, those are gastroliths. He said, but my question is, now remember, this guy is new to paleontology. He's just a visitor. He said, my question is, how could this lay here and last for 65 million years? Wouldn't it show some weatherization by now? And I said, I think you're correct. He thought the fossil he was picking up was 65 million years old, but his eye saw something that hadn't been exposed to the elements. And he couldn't figure. So when I began to explain to him the biblical timeline of just thousands of years, not millions of years. He looked at me and he said, well, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Why the evidence I have in my hand. Then you get to Montana and you're walking through this area in the Badlands and there's huge dinosaurs are buried. These things are Edmontosaurus, bigger than an elephant, wadded up into a dirt pile that I could actually probably park my car over because the bones are just mangled and tore up from all the mud and stuff like that. You wouldn't expect that because every picture you see of a dinosaur fossil, they're all nice and pretty laid out, put together like a puzzle piece.
Right.
That's not how you find them.
Yes.
You might find the toe bone up by the head. You might find the tailbone sticking 5 feet away. That tells us they were pushed there by the mud flows and watered up. I encourage everybody to go to Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. There you're going to see the famous quarry wall. It's actually a whole slab of sediment that has been pushed straight up, almost in a vertical position. And they have exposed dinosaur bones by the hundreds and left them there. So you can see these bones half exposed by the hundreds. But then again, the question is, what pushed up a huge layer of sediments that were solid rock straight up that today you and I could not lift it with the biggest crane we could find? You go outside of the building where the wall is, and you see that the rocks behind it are rolled up like cookie dough, rolled up behind it like mud flows. That's what pushed the sediments up. So the next question, what was pushing the mud flows? You see where we're going with this is there's cause and effect. So a lot of people expect they're going to walk outside, move a little dirt, and find a dinosaur laying there nice and flat. And they're not going to find that, actually. What they're going to find is they're going to find fragments. And sometimes once our current rock becomes eroded and begins weathering away and exposing the bones now exposed to the elements begin to deteriorate, and we find mutated, kind of messed up looking bones, and they're white because they're sun bleached, they're cracking, and you have to put them back together. You wouldn't expect that because of the pictures we see on TV and in the books.
Here's another interesting question. When you're out on a dig and you're finding all these bones, how do you know how to put them back together in the right way?
We don't. No. It's hard to understand when you look at the bones and you say, okay, where's this go? Vertebrae, easily identified. Now, putting the vertebrae in the right order and getting the right amount, because sometimes a vertebrae might be missing because it was when it was buried, it got ejected from the death site, or maybe an animal's came by now because the bones are exposed, and it's just digging around. Maybe it rolled down the hill and now it's disintegrated. So you have to say, do I have all the vertebrae? And scientists, biologists, and other things have studied the animals, and they'll look at the vertebrae and they'll say, okay, for vertebrae to go from this size down to the tail, there would be a step down size. So if you're missing some, you would see a drastic drop and you realize, okay, there's missing vertebrae. And then they try to realign them. The thing you want to find is the jaws, the skull, and the pelvis. Those are the 3 bones on the fossil, especially on the dinosaur, that are flat. Those are the most fragile. Those are the ones that get destroyed first. Because during the pressurization of being fossilized, a lot of times those things are just pulverized. And you're left with headless dinosaurs. But now you got to say, well, what kind of dinosaur was this? But let's say there was another species of dinosaur laying a few feet away, and there's a skull. And you uncover the skull. Your first question is, does that skull belong to my dinosaur skeleton? So the questions aren't always answered. They're not always, and you take time to put them together. Then maybe somebody I know in another city has dug up the same species of dinosaur, and they have parts I was missing. Maybe theirs was better articulated than mine. And we start examining. All of a sudden, we reposition the fossils, we rebuild the fossil, and then we update the books. So some of the dinosaurs they used to draw in the books in 1950 had the big, tall, 4-legged sauropods laying on their belly with their legs spread out like lizards, with their tails on the ground, and had them walking like a modern-day lizard through the dirt. We now know the sauropods stood upright, their tails didn't drag the ground, and they were tall as trees. They weren't laying on the ground. And the giant sauropods are not related to lizards. So that kind of gives you an answer, Taylor, that putting them together, that's the hard part. Preparing them to put them together for the display is the hard part. That's where the work begins. And not always do we get it right. Sometimes we put them in the wrong place, and it takes us a few years to figure it out. You have to be willing to say, oh, I made a mistake there. So anytime you hear somebody say, oh, I just so-and-so discovered a dinosaur last year, and it's on display in the museum, I question that because it might take up to 3 to 4 or 5 years to get the bones in the right order, to get them ready for display. Prepping the fossils and getting them displayed right is a long process, and there's a whole industry that has built up around that where they specialize in that. Most people just can't grab bones and put them in the right order right away.
I know I can't.
It's like a puzzle that you have no box.
And sometimes the pieces are missing.
No, guys.
And sometimes there's pieces from the wrong box in your box.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to keep going back, but I'd like to backtrack a little bit back on to my previous question of the digs that you and your team went on. This was the team from the museum
Yes.
that did these digs. What have you found on your digs?
Well, one of our team members in Kansas found a tooth of a very, very rare shark species called the Ginsu shark. Another team member found the vertebrae backbone of mosasaur. We've also found different kinds of plants. Some of the Xiphacthinus, which is the extinct fish, Semilichthus. So again, there's some of those names that we don't like, but we need to find a new cool nickname for those guys. We found those. In Texas, we found Acrocanthosaurus prints. And one of our friends down there has actually found, he was the only person to ever find the bones of Acrocanthosaurus. That's how they were able to identify the footprints.
Wow.
Because it's a three-toed dinosaur, we're not sure who they belong to, but whenever Acrocanthosaurus bones were discovered there, they had previously identified that dinosaur in Washington, D.C. Just to sidetrack a little bit, underneath the Washington Mall is fossils of Acrocanthosaurus, and they also find it in Texas. So we found those kind of species. Colorado, we found the vertebrae of a sauropod laying on top, across the top of it, crossing it, was the rib bone of an allosaur. So here you have a three-legged dinosaur rib bone laying on top of a four-legged dinosaur backbone. Now, somebody not being able to identify those would come in and think they were the same species.
Okay.
About 50, 60 feet below that, sticking out the side of the hill, is Stegosaurus plates. Well, they've not been uncovered yet because you have to start at the top of the mountain, removing soil, and work your way down to the fossil. You can't dig in from the sides. But the plates are exposed, so we put winter jackets on them to protect them from the weather. In Montana, we found a giant bone of a triceratop. It's one of the bones that would attach from the pelvis going towards the abdomen. These bones is where the tendons of the stomach would attach to, because you think of a triceratop, twice the size of a minivan, running down the road, the abdomen and the stomach area is going to be swaying. That's painful. It's not good on the muscles. So God designed those particular animals with these anchor points that stabilize that. So if you think of this huge animal, and if it doesn't have the weight swinging side to side, it's able to go forward even faster. So I don't know how fast Triceratop could run, but I know it was not slowed down by the movement of its body. It could actually move in a linear fashion pretty quick, supposedly. But we found that. We found some other fragments of bones. Now, we call these floaters. These are dinosaur bones and other bones of other creatures that have disintegrated from exposure. They are laying on the ground, loose on top of the soil, and you just pick them up, and you don't know who they belong to, but a lot of times it's the bone marrow and stuff like that. And then we have found plants that have been fossilized, which is really cool to find. That's one of the coolest things to those when you're looking for dinosaur bones and you find plants. Because you're like, wow, I didn't expect to find a plant here. And you think, well, what about the dinosaur bone? Well, that's really cool, but if you find a plant next to it, you start making the conclusion that maybe these are the plants the dinosaurs ate. And then your mind just starts racing. So there's a thing in paleontology we like to do when we're on a dig, and we like to tell stories. We call it storytelling. So you find a little loose bone, and you come back to the campfire at night, and you're having your debriefing time of what everybody's found. And if you find a random bone, it is your time to make up a story about how it got there, what was going on. And it was being chased by this huge T-Rex. And you can just go, let your man. And it's a fun time to do.
Oh, well, that is very neat. Thank you, Curtis, for joining us. I think we're just going to wrap up the very first episode of the Creation Matters podcast. And like we were discussing earlier, just introducing the museum, if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, just kind of to leave our audience with of just how do you get information about the museum, maybe if they'd like to come visit. You mentioned it was free admission.
Yes. If they would like to find out more information, then go to our website, creationexperiencemuseum.com.
Okay.
And once they're on the website, they'll find tabs and stuff where they can navigate. One of them is visit. And when they get there, they'll find information about us. You'll also find our building projects that we have going on. You'll find some of the other things available through our ministry. There you'll also find some archived newsletters and things on our website. You can also call 417-561-0750. If nobody answers, leave a voicemail, and we have people that'll get back with you and schedule that. The other thing is, if you're in Branson, Missouri area, come by and visit us. We're on Highway 65, just north of Branson. There's a big, giant cross that another ministry has built. It's the tallest cross in North America, so you really can't miss it. If you find that cross, there's an outer road, just drive down it, you'll find our little museum. And one of the things that I always like to leave people with on this is that fossils confirm the Bible. Mm-hmm. Paleontology confirms the Bible. There really was a worldwide flood. The Bible's record is true. And if the Bible's historical record is true, the entire Bible is true. Mm-hmm. History proves itself. The history of the Bible has been tested. It has been proven. It's withstood the test of time. Mm-hmm. There's no reason for us to believe that fossils somehow escaped the biblical record and they were created at a different time. Because one of the coolest things you'll ever see when you come to the museum is some very rare fossils we have that show dinosaurs and man living together in the fossil record.
All right. Thank you very much. That wraps this episode up. Until next time, everybody.
Thanks for listening.